violence breaks out as kind of a prelude to the 7 Years' War in 1754 with Jumonville Glen. And the 7 Years' War doesn't begin with Jumonville Glen, because remember, the 7 Years' War is a world war, and it really begins in 1756 with the Battle of Minorca, which is a large naval battle, and it takes place in the Mediterranean. But you see some of the initial violence in North America that's going to kind of be a prelude to this war with Jumonville Glen. And Jumonville Glen is a wonderful story that I think your students would appreciate, and it features a very young man, a very young Anglo-American man. He was raised in America, but he loves England, and he's working for the English government, and he's working in the English army as a provincial officer. And he is given the task of going into western Pennsylvania with some of his troops and some Amerindian allies that he has, and he is given the task of looking to see where exactly the French are, and he is allowed to use violence if he sees the French encroaching on English territory or disrupting English trade, because the English were very afraid that with the French so deep in North America, they were going to disrupt English trade with Amerindians and others. And so this young man takes his troops, and he takes his Amerindian allies, and he goes through, and he is looking for the French, and he's kind of aware that there's a French group kind of following him and tracing him, and he thinks, aha, rather than be ambushed by these French people who are following me, I will ambush them first. And so early one morning, this young man and his troops and his Amerindian allies, they creep up and they find the French, and they open fire and they kill many French people, and the whole time there's a man waving a white piece of paper at him. And so finally the officer calms everybody down to look at this white piece of paper, and this young man is an Anglo-American. He doesn't understand any French, and of course the letter is in French, and of course the person trying to hand it to him is French. And the person who's trying to hand it to him, by the way, is a French man named Jumonville. And so while this young man is trying to read the letter, one of his Amerindian allies takes a tomahawk, splits the head of Jumonville, and then starts to ritually wash his hands in the dead man's brains. This is a wonderful story. So the Anglo-American officer panics a little bit. He takes the message, which essentially is a message of peace, saying, we want to know what you're doing here. What are you doing here creeping around? And he starts to head back to the east. And of course he's being followed, because now he's done horrible violence against the French. Now he's being followed by a man named Villiers, who is Jumonville's brother, who is of course seeking revenge. And this man is running with what's left of his troops and left of his Amerindian allies. It's pouring rain. He's not making much progress. He knows he's going to have to make a stand because the French are encroaching on him. So he stops and he builds a fort out of pure necessity, and he names the fort Fort Necessity. And after some time of fighting with his enemies, he finally says, I have to surrender to the French. There's no way I can make a stand anymore. And so Villiers approaches this young officer, and he presents him with essentially a surrender treaty, and which he has to sign. And the surrender treaty seems to be pretty generous, because he's allowed to keep his life, he can keep his troops, he only has to give over 2 hostages, and he can return to his commander. And so this surrender treaty is in French. The Anglo-American still does not read French, but he signs his name to it and goes on his way. What the poor man does not realize is that when he signed his name, he signed a full confession to the murder of Jumonville, which, since this is a little skirmish that happened in the backwoods of western Pennsylvania, might not seem like such a big deal, but it set off a huge diplomatic catastrophe as people back in France reacted very violently to the idea that their men in North America are being murdered in cruel and harsh ways by the English barbarians. And it puts a lot of patriotic fuel into France.